Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, senior editor at Forbes. The 2024 hurricane season has officially come to an end, and with its end, AccuWeather is projecting that it was one of the costliest hurricane seasons in modern history, with nearly $500 billion worth of economic damage for the U.S. Here to explain more is Alex DaSilva. He's AccuWeather's lead hurricane forecaster. Alex, thanks so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you for having me.
So it is December. Hurricane season has officially come to a close. Let's start with top line takeaways. What is your conclusion about how the 2024 hurricane season went?
Yeah, well, certainly it has been a very, very busy season. We saw 18 total named storms during the hurricane season, well above average. 11 of those became hurricanes, and of those 11 hurricanes, we saw 5 major hurricanes. And you can really see all the clustering in the Gulf of Mexico and in the Western Caribbean. So a lot of these storms, unfortunately, did have impacts here in the United States. And so that, I think, was a very big standout point. Was it wasn't just about how busy it was also about how many impacts we had so far, or had in the 2024 season.
What were you projecting at the top of the year? I remember talking to you in June and it was looking like it might be a busy season, but how do those final numbers tally up to what you had been forecasting in the spring?
Yeah, well, we got the number of hurricanes and major hurricanes and United States impact right on the nose in terms of the number of hits we had to the United States. We could have seen a few more storms, except I think there was a lot of dry air during the middle of the season. If you remember, we had a lull at the end of August and into the beginning of September, which kind of kept the numbers down. We still had 18 named storms, but had we not seen that dry air in the middle of the season, we could have very well been into the 20s for the hurricane season. But it really doesn't matter the number of storms, it matters the amount of impacts. And unfortunately, this season, we saw impact after impact after impact. If we pull up our impact, our landfall graphic here, it started with Beryl, along the Texas coast, and you can see all these other impacts. We even had the unnamed tropical system in September in South Carolina there. So impacts across the entirety of the Gulf Coast and even up into the Carolinas as well.
Let's get into some of these named storms. Obviously, Beryl, Milton, Helene, we've talked a lot about these storms, but what can we say now about the total amount of damage they wrought?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, we did see, like you mentioned, about $500 billion worth of damage if you include the economic damage and the physical damage as well. But you have to look beyond just physical damage, like I just mentioned. It's the economic damage. A lot of these areas that were hit are big tourism places. You have to look at the insurance premiums that will be increasing, things like that. So all of that gets factored in into AccuWeather's preliminary damage estimates here. And as you can see, these numbers are extremely, extremely impressive. Multiple storms creating over $20 billion in damage. And then you can look at Helene, which was the biggest damage maker, about $250 billion in economic damage. And then Milton, number 2, about $160 to $180 billion in economic damage. And if you total all of these up, again, looking at about $500 billion in economic damage.
How does that compare to 2023 and in prior years? We started this conversation saying it's one of the costliest, but have the numbers been roughly in the same ballpark for the past few years?
They've been increasing. They're certainly higher than they were last year, but we also had more impacts to the United States than we did in previous years. And so, and also you have to consider inflation into these numbers as well. But certainly we had many more impacts this season as we've had in previous seasons. 2020 was another big impact year a couple of years ago. So that's one that many folks remember. But this year, I think, was just exceptionally impactful. And it wasn't just at the coast. That's something that we really saw this year. We saw impacts well inland. Helene, of course, a lot of damage in the southern Appalachians. That's well away from where the storm made landfall. And then if you remember, Beryl brought a lot of tornadoes to upstate New York. So we saw impacts well away from the center of circulation. And that's a point we really continue to press here, is that even though a storm may make landfall in one particular location near the Gulf Coast, even if you live well away from that center of circulation, you still need to be on the lookout for impacts.
Of course, and we saw that in North Carolina with Helene and Milton kind of right back to back and the mudslides that you talked about. As you look at that map that's in front of you and you look at the impact that we saw from these named storms this year, what has been the biggest factor or biggest few factors that led to the number of storms and the intensity of these storms?
I think it was the sea surface temperatures. We've been talking about this the last couple of years, just how warm it is down in the Gulf of Mexico and Western Caribbean. These two areas here have been exceptionally, exceptionally warm. Well, in fact, the whole basin has been above average pretty much, but these areas in particular, a little bit closer to home here, have been just exceptionally warm, well above the historical average in terms of sea surface temperatures. But it's not only about the sea surface temperatures, it's about how deep into the ocean those warm waters extend. And in these areas here, we call that ocean heat content. In these two areas here, we saw that ocean heat content at record levels. So the warm water wasn't just at the surface, it extended far below, hundreds and hundreds of feet below the surface of the ocean. And that is what really gave these cyclones fuel during the season. We saw multiple storms this year undergo rapid intensification in this area here. And my fear is that when we move into the future, if the water temperatures continue to remain exceptionally warm in this area, we could continue to see storms undergo rapid intensification in this area.
Now, I am speaking to you from New York, where we're in the middle of a cold snap. I know right now that cold snap is extending down the East Coast. I have a friend in South Carolina who said she was not prepared for the temperatures getting as cold as they are right now. Is there a chance that increased cold fronts could help lower that ocean temperature and maybe mitigate hurricane season for 2025?
I don't think it would make really much of a difference. It might in the short term. So in the winter, maybe those temperatures get knocked down a little bit. But by the time we get into next season, I don't think it's really going to matter. I think those temperatures are going to come ramping right back up. Even right now, I was just looking at some data. Even though we're starting to see some cold air get down into the southeast, the temperatures in this area are still above average for this time of the year. So the cold fronts would have a lot of work to do if they're going to be knocking down those temperatures. There was just so much heat in the Caribbean and in the Gulf of Mexico that a couple of cold fronts are really not going to make all that much of a difference. Like I said, they're still above average right now for this time of the year. They might drop a little bit, but I'm afraid that that's not going to really make a difference when it comes to next tropical season.
We'll get into your predictions for 2025, but I just want to continue with the 2024 recap. We've talked major storms, named storms, major impacts, but what about tropical storms and tornadoes? Have you ranked how this season came out in terms of these other weather events that often come with a hurricane?
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is our chart here showing where this season ranks amongst other seasons. So it ranks number 3 in terms of tropical tornadoes since 1995. That's when the tropical tornado data has kind of been kept. So it's a relatively new statistic, but ranks number 3. You can look at U.S. hurricane landfalls. This is the 4th highest year for that. 5th highest year for hurricanes since 1850, 9th highest for major hurricanes, and 9th highest for the named storms. But if we look at the number of tornadoes here, you can see the tornadoes by storm here. You can see Beryl again, 68 tornadoes from Beryl. A lot of those were well away from the center of circulation up in New York State. And then you can go down the list here. Of course, Helene and Milton had a lot of powerful tornadoes. Milton even had a couple of EF3 tornadoes, which is very uncommon in tropical systems. Very, very impressive storm there. So again, some tropical systems produce a lot of tornadoes. Some don't produce that many. And the research is still being done as to why certain storms produce a lot more than others. But this season, it seemed like almost every storm was producing a lot of tornadoes.
Is that a record number of tornadoes in one hurricane season?
It's not. If we pull up the chart here, 2024 ranks 3rd with 178 tropical tornadoes. It trails 2004 and 2005, which were exceptional years for tropical development. A lot of people remember those 2 years. Those were very big years in the Atlantic. So it only trails those 2 years in terms of tropical tornadoes, but it doesn't really matter. That is still a very, very impressive stat. 178 tropical tornadoes this season.
I mean, if you look at that map, that's all within the last 20 years of significant tornado activity. What's your message for viewers and residents in the areas that have been affected by tornadoes over the last 1, 5, 10 years? Is there anything they can or should do this winter to prepare for 2025?
Yeah, I think the thing is just to follow the forecast closely when there's tropical systems moving through the area because, like I said, the impacts can stretch well beyond the center of circulation. We saw that with Milton, especially, where the storm was on the west coast of Florida there, but we still saw lots of tornadoes along the east coast. So we don't want people to let their guard down that just because they're not going to be facing the eye wall of a storm, they can still see significant impacts that can bring a lot of damage with these tornadoes. And even we go back to Beryl, people in upstate New York, we want people anywhere within the possible path of a storm to pay close attention. Even if the storm is not going to bring, that much wind, they can still produce tornadoes, and those tornadoes can bring a lot of wind. It would be very localized, of course. Tornadoes are, very small compared to hurricanes. But again, those can bring significant impacts, even well away from where the storm made landfall.
As you look at the cycle of hurricanes this season, is there anything that surprised you in terms of the months that they hit? You kind of mentioned the dry air in late August, early September. Did it extend later in the season? What other conclusions are you drawing right now as you assess the year that was?
Yeah, one of the most impressive things that we noticed was Beryl. Beryl was the earliest Category 5 on record. If I point down here, this is where the storm developed into a Category 5 down across the eastern and central Caribbean there. And that was the earliest Category 5 hurricane on record by a whole 2 weeks. 2 weeks. So that is very impressive there. So that was a very impressive start to the hurricane season. And then things kind of died down in the middle, right? We didn't see a whole lot of activity during the second half of August and even the beginning of September. And that was a large in part due to a lot of dry air coming across Africa, coming all the way across the Atlantic, really stopping a lot of that development from going on. However, as we got midway to the end of September, that dry air really started to shut off, and then the Atlantic really exploded. And then we saw a lot of activity September, October, and even into November, we saw activity. And so this was a very active November as well. We had 3 named storms during the month of November. The average in November is about 1 storm every 2 years. And so we saw 3. And so that just goes to show how much of an impact these warm waters really have in a month where we typically don't see a whole lot of tropical activity. We saw 3 named storms, and we were always talking about this ever since the beginning of the season, that we thought this was going to be a back half loaded tropical season because we expected a lot of the wind shear to die off as we got closer to a La Nina pattern. It did die off, a lot of it. We never really got to La Nina during the tropical season, but we got awfully close, and that caused a lot of the wind shear in here to die off or get significantly weaker. And that really caused that explosion we saw in the second half of the season.
So obviously 2024's hurricane season just wrapped up. We are only 2 days into December, but is there anything you can tell us about what your early projections for the 2025 hurricane season will be?
Yeah, I mean, I've been looking at a couple of things. It's too early to certainly put numbers on it, but early indications are that the water temperatures are going to be above average once again in the Caribbean, Gulf of Mexico, off the southeast coast. So there's nothing really standing out to me showing that we're going to be seeing a significant amount of cooling. So that's certainly a concern for the next season. So that's something that we're really going to have to watch carefully. We usually put out our forecast here at AccuWeather in March, but we start looking at it a few weeks before then. And so taking a look at, it's December obviously right now, but, early indications are that it could potentially be busy once again if those water temperatures stay above average. Again, early indications are that they will, but we still have many more months to keep an eye on it. But again, that is a very big concern here going into future years, that unless we see some significant cooling in these areas, those water temperatures are going to be driving a lot of the tropical season. Of course, there are other caveats as well. We saw that in the middle of the season this year with the dry air. So the water temperatures can be plenty warm. But if there's a lot of dry air, that can really shut down a season or a part of a season. We saw that this year. So just because you have those warm waters does not necessarily mean it's going to be a hyperactive season, but it tends to lean in that direction. So again, a little too early to put numbers on it now, but right now, I am concerned that the water temperatures are going to be above average for next tropical season.
So it's really the mix of water plus the air. Is there anything that could lower those ocean temperatures? Anything that human interaction could do, or are we just dependent on the weather systems to bring down those temperatures?
Yeah, I think it's just kind of dependent on the weather systems. If we see a very cold January, February, March, in the southeast. Maybe that can knock some of those temperatures down. However, again, tropical season is mainly, end of August, September, and into October. That's when the heart of the season is. So even if it's a cold winter down here, those temperatures are going to have plenty of time to rebound during the spring. So I think we would have to see something really, really big, a lot of cold air coming down. And I just don't see that happening right now to really knock those temperatures down significantly enough that it would make a difference during the tropical season.
Now, obviously, I know you are a hurricane expert, but I am sitting here praying for snow. We have not had a white Christmas in a minute, or I at least have not experienced Central Park in the snow in far too long. Is there anything that you can say about how hurricane season might affect the snowfall in the Northeast or across the states this winter?
I don't really think it has any impact whatsoever. Just because it was a busy hurricane season does not necessarily mean it's going to be a busy snow season. It's two totally different seasons, essentially, different weather systems impacting different variables coming together. So I don't really think it's going to play a role. If we have a very snowy winter, I don't think it had anything really to do with the hurricane season. So kind of two different seasons, and I don't really think they have any relationship to one another.
Alex DaSilva, lead hurricane forecaster at AccuWeather. Thank you so much for joining us all season to break down these storms. And we'll have to check in with you in March when you formalize your predictions for the 2025 hurricane season. But in the meantime, thank you so, so much, as always, for your insight.
Thank you very much.